Long after London falls asleep, Baker Street begins to remember footsteps that no one living should be making, and Holmes realizes the disturbance is not meant to frighten, but to be understood. Before the mystery unfolds, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. If this helps you relax, subscribing keeps the stories coming. The familiar quiet of Baker Street arrived as it always did, gradually and without ceremony. The last carriage passed, its wheels softened by distance. Footsteps faded into memory. Even the restless murmur of London seemed to draw inward, as though the city itself had decided to rest. Inside 221B, the lamps burned low. Holmes sat in his armchair, long fingers steepled, eyes half closed. To a casual observer, he might have appeared asleep. Watson knew better. There was a particular stillness to Holmes when his attention had narrowed to something faint, something most would never think to notice. It was not a sound that disturbed him. It was the absence of one. Baker Street possessed its own rhythm, a quiet language of settling wood, distant clocks, the occasional sigh of pipes cooling behind the walls. Holmes had lived among these sounds long enough to know when they changed. Tonight, the house did not settle. It waited. Watson, seated at the small writing desk near the window, paused mid-sentence and glanced toward his companion. "Do you hear that?" he asked softly. Holmes did not open his eyes. "Yes," he replied, "and more importantly, I hear what should be there, but is not." Watson listened more intently. The silence felt layered, almost attentive. The air itself seemed to hold a delicate tension, as though the rooms were aware of their occupants and chose not to intrude. "It feels," Watson searched for the word, "as if the house is awake." Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. An apt description. Midnight passed unnoticed. The clock on the mantel gave its soft acknowledgement of the hour, and then the silence returned. Deeper now, fuller. Holmes rose and crossed the sitting room with measured steps, his movements slow and deliberate. He paused near the doorway, resting his hand lightly against the wall. The plaster was cool, solid. Yet beneath it, Holmes sensed a history layered thickly enough to be felt rather than seen. "This building has listened to many lives," he said quietly. "More than it has revealed." Watson joined him, lowering his voice instinctively, though no one else was present. "You've never mentioned Baker Street behaving oddly before." "Because it rarely does," Holmes replied. "And when it does, it is usually dismissed as imagination." A faint sound drifted through the flat then. Not a footstep, not quite a creak. It was subtle enough that Watson almost doubted it had occurred at all. A suggestion of movement, carefully restrained. They both turned toward the staircase. The sound did not repeat. Watson felt a curious chill, not of fear, but of recognition, the sense that something familiar had shifted, ever so slightly, out of alignment. "Perhaps the building is simply settling differently tonight," he offered. "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but structures, like people, settle according to habit. This is deviation." He moved toward the staircase, ascending only a few steps before stopping. The stairway lay in shadow, the banister polished smooth by generations of hands. Holmes observed the angles of the walls, the way sound would travel, how silence gathered. 221B has been altered more than once," Holmes continued. "Rooms subdivided, walls adjusted, purposes reassigned. Such changes leave impressions." Watson considered the idea. "You speak as though the house remembers." "In a way," Holmes replied, "it does." They returned to the sitting room, though neither resumed their former occupations. The night pressed gently against the windows, and somewhere far off, a church bell marked the passing hour. Holmes remained standing now, his attention attuned not outward, but inward, to the subtle dialogue between space and stillness. "This is not a haunting," Holmes said at last, "not in the way stories would suggest." Watson nodded slowly. "Then what is it?" Holmes looked around the room, the familiar furniture, the the shelves heavy with books, the quiet domestic order they had built within these walls. "It is a reminder," he said, "that places, like people, carry unfinished sentences." As the night deepened, the house did not disturb them further, yet the sense of watchfulness remained, gentle, patient, unthreatening. Holmes extinguished the lamp at last, leaving the room in shadow. Baker Street did not rest, it listened. And Holmes, lying awake long after Watson's breathing slowed into sleep, listened in return. Sleep came to Watson slowly that night, not because of unease, but because the quiet itself felt altered. It lay heavier than usual, like a blanket drawn too carefully over the senses. When he finally drifted off, it was into a light, shallow rest, the sort that leaves one aware of time passing even while the mind wanders. It was a sound that woke him, not a noise precisely, more a rhythm. Watson opened his eyes to darkness, the faint outline of the sitting room barely visible in the muted glow from the street lamp outside. For a moment he lay still, listening. His first thought was that Holmes had risen and was moving about the flat, restless as ever, but the sound did not match Holmes's habits. There was no hesitation, no sudden pause followed by quickened steps. These were measured, slow, even, deliberate. Footsteps moved above the familiar stair, crossing the upper level of the flat with quiet certainty. Each step landed with identical pressure, neither hurried nor tentative, as though the walker knew the path intimately and had no need to see it. Watson sat up slightly, his breath held without conscious intent. He waited for a cough, a rustle of fabric, the faint exhale of a living presence. There was none. The footsteps continued. They passed from left to right, then faded, not away, but into stillness, as though the walker had simply chosen to stop existing in sound. Watson strained to hear more, but the silence returned, smooth and complete. He glanced toward Holmes's chair. Holmes sat motionless, eyes open now, reflecting a thin line of lamplight. He had heard it too. "You heard that," Watson said softly. "Yes," Holmes replied. His voice carried no surprise. "And I believe it heard you." Watson frowned. "Heard me?" "You woke," Holmes said, "and it adjusted." Watson swung his legs from the bed and stood, the floor cold beneath his feet. He moved toward the staircase, pausing at its base. The stair rose as it always had, narrow and slightly worn at the center, each step familiar beneath his gaze. "There's no one there," Watson said. "No," Holmes agreed. "Not now." They waited. Minutes passed. Watson became acutely aware of his own breathing, the soft tick of the mantel clock, the distant murmur of London's sleep. Just as he began to question his own certainty, the footsteps returned, this time closer. They descended no stair. Instead, they moved parallel to it, pacing along the upper floor where the corridor connected the bedrooms and the storage rooms beyond. The sound was precise. Heel, then soul, then heel again. The cadence of a person accustomed to moving quietly, but not secretly. Still no breath. Still no shadow. Watson tilted his head, attempting to place the sound spatially. "It doesn't echo correctly," he whispered. "It should bounce off the walls." "Which suggests," Holmes murmured, "that the sound is not behaving as sound should." The footsteps paused directly above them. Watson felt a curious sensation then. Not fear, but an odd intimacy, as though someone stood just beyond sight, aware of their presence, but uninterested in acknowledgement. "Holmes," Watson said, keeping his voice low, "if this were a person—" "It is not," Holmes interrupted gently. The footsteps resumed, crossing the space once more, then receding. They did not fade with distance, they simply stopped. Watson exhaled slowly. "There was intention in that," he said. "It wasn't random." "No," Holmes replied. "It was habitual." They did not pursue the sound. Holmes remained still, as though movement might disrupt something delicate. When at last the silence settled fully, It felt altered again, less watchful now, almost satisfied. Watson returned to his bed but did not sleep. His thoughts moved carefully, circling the experience without grasping at explanation. He had encountered danger often enough to recognize fear, and this was not it. There was no menace in the footsteps, only purpose. As the hours crept toward dawn, Watson realized something else. The sound had not crossed into their space. It had respected an invisible boundary, stopping short of intrusion. Whatever walked the upper floor of 221B did not wish to disturb. It wished only to be remembered. Morning light revealed nothing unusual. That, Holmes observed, was precisely the point. The sitting room appeared unchanged, its familiar order intact, the staircase rising as it always had, the corridor above it silent and empty. Yet Holmes moved through the space with deliberate care, as though walking across the surface of a still pond whose depth could not be guessed at a glance. Watson watched from the armchair, tea cooling forgotten at his side. "You intend to listen again," he said. "I intend to understand," Holmes replied. He began with stillness. No pacing, no tapping. He stood in various points of the room, eyes closed, allowing the house to speak in its own language. He listened not only for sound, but for how sound failed, where it softened too quickly, where it lingered longer than physics would allow. Sound, Holmes said quietly, is obedient. It reflects, it diminishes, it travels according to rules. When it disobeys, something is guiding it. He asked Watson to walk the upper corridor slowly, his steps measured, his pace even. Watson complied, the soles of his slippers brushing the carpet above. Holmes listened from below, shifting his position slightly after each pass. "Again," Holmes called. Watson turned and retraced his steps. The sound behaved as expected, muffled, distant, softened by layers of wood and fabric. Holmes nodded, then gestured for Watson to stop. "Now stand still," Holmes said, "and speak." Watson cleared his throat. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," Holmes replied, "as I should." He took a few steps toward the base of the staircase. "But last night, the footsteps did not follow this path." Watson descended and joined him. They sounded closer than that. Almost displaced. Exactly. Holmes moved to the far wall and tapped it lightly with his knuckle. The sound returned dull and contained. He tapped again, slightly higher. This time the echo was faintly altered, thinner, more distant. "There," Holmes murmured. "Do you hear it?" Watson leaned closer. "It sounds as though the wall isn't solid all the way through." "Because it isn't," Holmes replied. "Not entirely." He continued his examination, tapping, listening, observing the way vibrations travelled, or failed to. In certain places, sound seemed to vanish abruptly, as though swallowed. In others, it appeared unexpectedly, re-emerging where no direct path existed. "These echoes," Holmes said, "are being redirected, not by chance, but by structure." Watson considered the implications. Hidden spaces. Yes, cavities, voids, alterations made quietly and long ago. Holmes ascended the staircase slowly, pausing at each step, allowing the sound of his own movement to inform him. He stopped midway and stamped lightly. The sound carried upward clearly. He stamped again, closer to the wall. The sound diminished unnaturally. "Interesting," Holmes murmured. Watson followed him up. At the top of the stairs, Holmes turned and paced the corridor, noting how his footsteps changed character, depending on where he stepped. Near the center, the sound behaved normally. Near the edges it softened, sometimes disappearing altogether. "The house has been reshaped," Holmes said. "Not recently, but deliberately." They paused near the storage rooms at the far end, spaces rarely used, filled with old trunks and forgotten items. Holmes opened one door, then another, listening to how the hinge creaked, how the sound lingered. "Last night's footsteps," Watson said slowly. They didn't echo like ours. No, Holmes replied. They were guided. He knelt and placed his ear near the floor, pressing his palm flat against the boards. After a moment, he smiled faintly. There is a channel beneath us, he said. Not a passage for bodies, but for sound. Watson frowned. Why would anyone build such a thing? For privacy, Holmes replied. For discretion, for movement without presence. They descended again, Holmes now attentive to the way the upper floor responded to their motion. He stopped beneath the precise spot where Watson had heard the footsteps pause the night before. Here, Holmes said. Watson felt it then, a strange acoustic pressure, as though the air itself behaved differently in that spot. Sound seemed to arrive there from elsewhere, gathered and concentrated. The footsteps, Watson said. They weren't walking above us. No, Holmes agreed. They were walking beside us, displaced through architecture. Watson considered this, a quiet awe settling over him. So the house isn't haunted? Holmes shook his head gently. No. It is inhabited by memory and design. He straightened, brushing dust from his coat. The sounds do not misbehave without reason. They obey a different set of rules, ones written into the walls. Watson looked around the room with new eyes. The familiar space now felt layered, its calm surface concealing thoughtful complexity beneath. And whoever created this illusion, Watson said, knew the house intimately. Yes, Holmes replied, intimately enough to make it speak without ever being seen. The house, as if in acknowledgement, settled softly around them. And for the first time since the footsteps began, Baker Street felt less restless, as though its secret, once observed, had eased into quieter patience. Night returned to Baker Street with a gentleness that invited careful attention. Holmes extinguished all but one lamp, allowing the sitting room to settle into a softened glow. The shadows that gathered were not deep, but thoughtful, resting in corners and along shelves as though they, too, wished to observe rather than intrude. This is how the house prefers to be seen, Holmes said quietly. Watson adjusted his chair, the lamplight tracing familiar outlines that now felt subtly altered. The room had not changed, yet it seemed newly articulate, as if the dimness allowed it to speak in details usually overwhelmed by daylight. Holmes began where he always did, at the edges. He moved his lamp slowly along the walls, its glow revealing variations in texture that daylight flattened into uniformity. Near the staircase, the plaster bore faint lines that did not align with the rest of the surface, the gentle scars of an old partition long removed. The marks were careful, almost respectful, as though the wall had been altered reluctantly. This was not always open, Holmes said. There was once a division here. Watson ran his fingers lightly over the surface. It's been disguised well. Yes, Holmes replied, but not erased. They continued their examination room by room, Holmes lifting the lamp to door frames, window casings, and ceiling seams. In several places, the woodwork bore signs of reattachment, nails set slightly off pattern, trim adjusted by fractions of an inch. These were not the haphazard changes of neglect, but the considered work of someone reshaping a space with intention. The renovations were made quietly, Holmes said, not for comfort, for discretion. Watson paused near the doorway to the bedrooms. The sound travels oddly here, he said, clapping his hands softly. The echo behaved as Holmes expected, or rather, as he had learned to expect. It faded too quickly near one wall and lingered too long near another, as though the corridor bent inward upon itself. Holmes smiled faintly. A subtle inconsistency, one that reveals more than it conceals. They moved upstairs, the lamplight trailing behind them like a careful thought. At the top of the stair, Holmes knelt and examined the baseboards. One section sat slightly higher than the rest, its edge worn smooth by contact. Repeated use, Holmes murmured. Not by accident. He pressed gently. The board did not move, but the sound it made, a muted, hollow response, confirmed what he suspected. Behind the walls, the house was not uniform. They entered the seldom used rooms, opening doors that creaked not from disuse, but from old habits, unrefreshed. Here, the signs were subtler still. A ceiling beam slightly out of alignment, a vent that led nowhere obvious, a patch of flooring newer than its surroundings. Watson felt a strange sense of familiarity in these spaces, as though the house had been lived in more fully than he had ever known. Whoever altered this place, he said, knew how to disappear within it. Yes, Holmes replied, and how to be present without being seen. He stopped near the storage room, lifting the lamp toward the ceiling. A faint seam ran across it, nearly invisible unless caught by low light. Holmes traced it with the beam. An old doorway, he said, closed, but not removed. Watson imagined the house as it once was, divided differently, moving differently, its sounds guided along paths now hidden. The footsteps he had heard no longer felt unnatural. They felt rehearsed. They weren't trespassing, Watson said softly. They were following an old map. Holmes nodded. Architecture remembers its first intentions. They returned to the sitting room, where the lamp cast a steady pool of light upon the rug. Holmes stood at the centre and spoke quietly. Sound behaves here as it once did, not as it appears to now. The house has been reconfigured, but not entirely rewritten. Watson felt a curious affection for the place then, not as a residence, but as a palimpsest, layers of life written and overwritten, never fully erased. Outside, Baker Street slept. Inside, the house revealed itself piece by piece, not as a haunted space, but as a thoughtful one. Holmes extinguished the lamp at last, leaving the room in darkness. The silence that followed felt calmer, less expectant. The house, having been seen properly, seemed content to rest. The answer, Holmes suspected, would not be found within the walls alone. Buildings told stories, but only in fragments. To understand the full shape of what lingered in Baker Street, Holmes turned once more to paper, to the quiet archives that preserved lives not through memory, but through record. He moved through them with the same patience he brought to a crime scene, aware that the smallest notation might hold the greatest meaning. The registry office was dim and orderly, its tall windows admitting a grey afternoon light that softened the rows of ledgers lining the walls. Holmes requested the tenancy records for Baker Street without elaboration, and Watson observed the clerk's mild surprise when the familiar address was spoken aloud. 221B had been known to many, but rarely examined. They found the entry after some searching. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, yet the handwriting remained precise. The flat had once been a single larger dwelling before it was divided. Its rooms were arranged differently then, its passages more fluid, its silences deeper. One name appeared repeatedly across the years. Edgar Halcombe. Watson read it aloud. A private tenant, no profession listed. Holmes studied the surrounding notes, which often means one that requires discretion. The records revealed little else. Halcombe had occupied the flat alone for nearly 20 years. Rent was paid on time, sometimes early. Repairs were requested rarely, and when they were, the notes mentioned modifications approved, structural alterations undertaken privately, and soundproofing adjustments. Soundproofing, Watson repeated. Yes, Holmes said, not to block sound, but to guide it. They searched further, tracing Halcombe's name through census records and municipal documents. He appeared consistently, always alone, always associated with Baker Street. There were no visitors listed, no household staff, no movement to another address. He lived here entirely, Watson said softly, as though the house was enough. Holmes nodded, and perhaps it was. A marginal note in one ledger drew Holmes's attention. It referred to Halcombe as a night archivist, employed briefly by a private firm whose records no longer existed. The work, it seemed, involved cataloguing documents after hours, away from public scrutiny. A man accustomed to silence, Holmes observed, and to moving unseen. They returned to Baker Street as evening fell, carrying the weight of this quiet life with them. The house seemed to receive the knowledge without resistance, as though relieved to have its history remembered. Holmes walked through the rooms again, this time imagining them as Halcombe had known them. The partitions still intact, the passages open, the sound moving as intended. He paused near the seam in the ceiling they had discovered earlier. He altered the house to suit his habits, Holmes said. Not to hide from others, but to allow himself to exist without interruption. Watson felt a pang of recognition. He didn't want to disappear. He wanted privacy. Yes, Holmes replied. There is a difference. The more they uncovered, the clearer the shape of Halcombe's life became. He had not been eccentric in the dramatic sense. He had been deliberate, careful, protective of quiet. Holmes found one final reference in an old municipal notice, a brief mention of Halcombe's departure. No date, no reason, simply vacated. No death record followed, no forwarding address. He didn't leave, Watson said. No, Holmes agreed. He remained, not in body, but in intention. The alterations, the guided sound, the careful shaping of space, all bore the mark of a man who had once lived in deep alignment with the house. When Holmes and Watson arrived years later, they had inherited not just rooms, but routines waiting to be remembered. That's why the footsteps feel familiar, Watson said. They're not intruding. They belong. Holmes stood quietly, listening as the house settled around them. The house has been repeating a life, he said, one that never fully concluded. The silence that followed was not uneasy. It was thoughtful, like a sentence waiting for its final word. Some people leave behind furniture, others leave architecture, and in the quiet hours of Baker Street, Edgar Halcombe's presence lingered not as a ghost, but as a habit too carefully built to vanish entirely. Holmes chose to explain the matter not as a revelation, but as a reassurance. They sat together in the sitting room as the fire settled into a low, steady glow. Outside, Baker Street lay quiet beneath a veil of mist, the city breathing evenly in its sleep. Holmes waited until the house itself had grown still, as though he wished it to listen along with Watson. What you heard, Holmes said at last, was never meant to frighten you. Watson leaned back in his chair, attentive. It succeeded only in unsettling me, he replied, which I suspect was the intention. Yes, Holmes said gently, but not through malice. He rose and crossed the room, pausing near the wall beside the staircase. He placed his palm flat against the plaster and left it there, as though feeling for a pulse. Buildings, he continued, are subject to forces most people ignore. Temperature, pressure, age. At night, when the air cools, materials contract. Wood shifts, stone responds. These changes are subtle, but not silent. Watson nodded. He had heard old houses creak and sigh before. But this was more than that. Indeed, Holmes replied, because those natural sounds were encouraged. He gestured toward the ceiling. The concealed voids we discovered act as conduits. When warm air rises and cooler air descends, it moves through those spaces, carrying sound with it, sometimes amplifying it, sometimes redirecting it entirely. Holmes demonstrated by opening a nearby window just enough to allow a faint draft. Almost immediately, a soft sound travelled through the wall, a low murmur that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. You hear that? Holmes asked. Watson listened carefully. It sounds as though it's coming from above. And yet it is not, Holmes said. The house is guiding it. He explained how the settling timbers, responding to the nightly change in temperature, produced faint movements, gentle shifts that, when aligned with the hollow spaces, could resemble footfalls. The key lay not in force, but in timing. The illusion only works, Holmes said, when it is allowed to. Watson considered this. So the footsteps occurred only after midnight because the conditions were right. And because someone ensured they were, Holmes added. He spoke then of deliberate actions, not dramatic, not constant, but precise. A window opened or closed at the right moment. A door adjusted to allow air to move through a narrow gap. A floorboard encouraged to respond by slight pressure applied elsewhere. These actions, Holmes said, are not the work of superstition, but of understanding. Edgar Halcombe knew his house intimately. He learned how it breathed. Watson felt a strange mixture of admiration and melancholy. He wasn't pretending to be a ghost. No, Holmes replied. He was preserving presence. Holmes returned to his chair and sat, his expression thoughtful. A true haunting seeks attention. This illusion seeks continuity. Watson recalled the steady, unhurried nature of the footsteps. They were never frantic, never aggressive. Because they were habitual, Holmes said. They followed a routine long practiced, reinforced by architecture and time. The house, as if in agreement, emitted a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a gentle settling that passed without significance now that it was understood. The mind, Holmes continued, is eager to supply meaning when it encounters pattern without explanation. A sound that behaves almost like a person invites the idea of presence. And once that idea takes root, Watson said, everything else follows. Precisely. Holmes allowed the silence to return, letting his explanation settle naturally rather than pressing it further. He knew that understanding did not dispel wonder. It refined it. This house, Holmes said softly, has never been haunted. It has been remembered. Watson looked around the room, the familiar furniture, the lamplight, the shadows resting easily now in their places. The sense of unease had faded, replaced by a quiet respect for the subtlety of what had occurred. The illusion, Holmes concluded, was not meant to deceive indefinitely. It was meant to persist just long enough for someone to listen carefully. Outside, the mist shifted along Baker Street. Inside, the house seemed to settle more comfortably into itself, no longer needing to suggest movement to be acknowledged. The presence had never been supernatural. It had been human, patient, deliberate, and deeply entwined with the rhythms of a place it refused to abandon. Once Holmes began to look for routine rather than intrusion, the house revealed itself more willingly. He did not search for moments of disturbance. He searched for repetition. For several nights, Holmes adjusted his own habits to mirror those of the unseen presence. He remained awake through the hours when Baker Street softened into its deepest quiet. He noted the intervals when the city paused, the last carriage fading, the final footstep retreating, the subtle moment when London seemed to listen inwardly rather than outward. It was always then that the house responded. The sounds did not occur randomly. They did not wander. They arrived with restraint and departed without urgency. A footstep here, a pause there, the faint suggestion of movement that never crossed into the sitting room, never intruded upon Watson's space, never broke the unspoken boundaries of the flat. Holmes observed this with growing certainty. "This is not exploration," he said quietly one night as they waited in stillness. "It is procession." Watson, seated nearby with his eyes closed, nodded slowly. "It feels scheduled." "Yes," Holmes replied, "but not by the clock. The disturbances followed a path, always the same one. They began near the upper corridor, passed the storage rooms, paused near the old partition line, and then faded before reaching the stair. Never earlier, never later, never reversed. Habit, Holmes knew, was more revealing than intent. He tested this gently. On one evening, he left a lamp burning in the upper corridor. The footsteps did not appear. On another, he shifted a chair slightly from its usual position beneath the old seam in the ceiling. That night, the sound paused longer than usual. as though acknowledging a change before continuing. "He adjusts," Watson murmured. "Yes," Holmes said, as one does when moving through a familiar space altered by time. The house was not reacting defensively. It was accommodating. Holmes charted the sequence carefully, not on paper but in memory. He noted the precise timing of each sound, the consistency of its restraint. The disturbances never occurred during storms, never during evenings of unusual noise. They respected the quiet of sleep rather than disrupting it. "This is not a warning," Holmes said, "nor an attempt to frighten." Watson considered the idea. "Then what is it meant to do?" "Continue," Holmes replied. The presence moved through Baker Street as it always had, not to be noticed, but to maintain order. It passed through rooms that no longer existed in their original form, honouring paths erased by renovation but remembered by habit. The illusion was not improvisation. It was repetition. Watson felt an unexpected tenderness toward the unseen figure. "He's not haunting us," he said softly. "He's living." "In the only way he knows how," Holmes agreed. One night, as they sat together listening, Watson realized something else. The routine avoided disruption entirely. It never crossed into their sleeping quarters. It never approached the sitting room when they occupied it. The presence was aware, not of fear, but of courtesy. "It's considerate," Watson said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and that tells us everything. Fear demanded attention. Habit required none." Holmes understood then that the illusion was not meant to persist indefinitely. It was a routine left unfinished, continuing only because it had never been acknowledged, like a door habitually checked after everyone had gone to bed, or a lamp extinguished long after its purpose had passed. "He doesn't know we understand yet," Watson said. "No," Holmes replied, "but he will." The house seemed calmer as the nights passed. The sounds softened further, their edges gentler now that observation had replaced suspicion. The routine did not intensify. It relaxed. Holmes did not confront the presence. He had no intention of forcing an ending where none was needed. Instead, he allowed the pattern to complete itself, night after night, until it no longer insisted upon repetition. Some habits ended only when they were witnessed. And in the quiet heart of Baker Street, a watchful routine continued. Not as menace, not as haunting, but as the echo of a life that had once moved carefully through those rooms, preserving order long after the world had stopped asking it to do so. Holmes did not reveal the truth at once. He had learned long ago that some answers, when dragged into light too quickly, lost their meaning entirely. Instead, he allowed the house to guide him, just as it had guided the sounds and silences that had first drawn his attention. It was in the narrow space behind the old partition line that the final understanding settled into place. Holmes stood there alone one afternoon, the house quiet but awake. The daylight filtered thinly through windows that had seen many arrangements of rooms and lives. He ran his fingers along the seam where wall met wall not quite as it should, feeling the subtle difference in temperature, the faint current of air that moved as though it had learned this path by repetition. There was a cavity here, not large, not dramatic, just enough space for concealment, just enough to hold something that needed to remain untouched. Holmes did not open it immediately. He listened. The illusion of movement, he realized, did not simply distract. It guided attention away from this place. The footsteps drew the ear upward and outward, encouraging listeners to imagine presence where none could be confirmed, while the true secret remained safely ignored behind stillness. This was not misdirection born of fear. It was protection. When Holmes finally eased the concealed panel aside, he did so with care, mindful that whatever lay beyond had survived precisely because it had never been forced into view. Inside, the space held no treasure, no instrument of crime, no object of scandal. It held papers, letters, folded carefully and bound with ribbon that had long since softened with age, a small leather-bound notebook, a few official documents bearing seals no longer in use. All arranged neatly, as though waiting rather than abandoned. Holmes examined them slowly, resisting the urge to read at once. He understood instinctively that this was not evidence meant for courts or headlines. It was a truth meant to endure quietly. The letters told a story of discretion and restraint. Edgar Halcombe, it seemed, had once been entrusted with sensitive information. Correspondence meant to be preserved, not acted upon. Names of individuals whose reputations had depended on silence. Matters resolved privately without public reckoning. Nothing criminal, nothing explosive, just truths that would have been misunderstood, misused or sensationalized had they been revealed at the wrong moment. These were never meant to disappear, Holmes murmured to himself, only to wait. The illusion of haunting, the careful manipulation of sound and space, had served a single purpose: to keep this place undisturbed. Anyone frightened away by whispers and footsteps would leave the walls untouched. Anyone curious enough to listen would eventually learn to do so gently. Watson joined Holmes later that evening, sensing from Holmes's manner that something essential had been uncovered. "It wasn't about hiding himself," Watson said after Holmes explained. "It was about hiding this." "Yes," Holmes replied, "and hiding it kindly." Holmes explained that exposure, even well-intentioned, could be destructive. These documents belonged to a time that no longer existed, involving people long gone, their consequences already resolved by quieter means. To bring them into public light now would not serve justice, it would only disturb peace. "So he stayed," Watson said softly, "not to haunt, to guard." Holmes nodded. "And he chose illusion over locks, suggestion over force." They returned the panel to its place, leaving no sign of disturbance. Holmes made no copies, took no notes. The knowledge itself was enough. Later, as night settled and the house breathed evenly once more, Watson listened carefully. The familiar disturbances did not appear. No footsteps passed above. No sound suggested movement. The silence felt different now. "It's resting," Watson said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "because it knows it has been understood." The secret preserved within Baker Street was not dramatic enough for legend, nor dangerous enough for pursuit. It was fragile precisely because it was human, composed of trust, restraint, and the quiet decision to let some truths remain unspoken. Holmes extinguished the lamp and allowed the darkness to settle naturally. Some secrets, he reflected, were not meant to be solved. They were meant to be kept, gently, patiently, and in silence. Holmes understood that endings, like beginnings, could be handled with care. There would be no knock at a hidden door, no sudden revelation delivered in firm tones. Baker Street had endured enough rearrangements of truth without another imposed upon it. Whatever resolution was required would need to arrive gently, as the disturbances themselves had done, quietly and without spectacle. Holmes began by doing nothing that could be seen. For several days, he altered no routines. He did not move furniture, did not adjust lamps, did not linger beneath the seams in the walls. He allowed the house to continue as it had, listening rather than intervening. This patience was deliberate. He wanted the presence that lingered within the walls to sense not threat, but understanding. Only when the nights grew calmer, when the footsteps softened and shortened, appearing less often, did Holmes begin the smallest of changes. He restored order where order had once existed. A door that had been habitually left ajar was closed gently each evening. A lamp was extinguished at a precise hour, not because it was necessary, but because it mirrored a pattern that had once mattered. Holmes did these things not as signals, but as acknowledgements, quiet affirmations that the routines remembered by the house had been noticed. Watson observed these changes with curiosity. "You're speaking to him," he said one night. "Yes," Holmes replied, in the only language he has chosen to use. The disturbances responded. The footsteps, when they came, no longer paused beneath the old partition line. They moved more briefly now, as though reassured. On one evening, the sound did not appear at all, and the silence that followed felt complete rather than strained. Holmes took this as permission. He returned to the hidden documents one final time, not to read them again, but to secure their rest. He adjusted their placement subtly, improving the conditions of their concealment without removing them from the house. A new lining protected them from damp. The panel was sealed more carefully, its edges aligned so perfectly that even deliberate searching would overlook it. "This place is not a vault," Holmes murmured. "It is a promise." Watson understood. "You're ensuring nothing draws attention again." "Yes," Holmes said, "including us." Holmes made one final visit to the registry office, where he quietly requested a notation be added to the building's records. Nothing remarkable, nothing alarming. A reference to structural peculiarity, a suggestion that no further alterations be made without careful review. Bureaucracy, when used gently, could be a form of protection. The nights that followed grew steadily quieter. When footsteps came, they were softer still, more suggestion than sound. Then they ceased altogether, not abruptly, but as habits naturally do when they are no longer required. Watson noticed the difference in his sleep first. He rested more deeply, waking without the sense that something unfinished lingered just beyond awareness. The house no longer seemed watchful. It seemed content. "One might almost miss it," Watson said one morning. Holmes smiled faintly. "One might miss a candle after dawn." The resolution had not required exposure, because exposure would have undone everything the illusion had protected. Edgar Halcombe's life, his discretion, his careful guardianship of silence, all would have been diminished by explanation. Instead, Holmes had offered acknowledgement without intrusion. On the final night before the case could be said to have ended, Holmes sat alone in the sitting room long after Watson had retired. The lamp burned low. The house settled naturally around him. No footsteps came. Holmes listened anyway, not because he expected disturbance, but because listening itself had become the point. Baker Street rested, not because its secret had been revealed, but because it had been allowed to remain intact, preserved not by fear, but by understanding. And in that quiet resolution, dignity remained where it belonged, unseen, unannounced, and undisturbed. Baker Street returned to sleep without ceremony. There was no final night marked by anticipation, no moment that announced itself as an ending. Instead, the house settled gradually, as though easing back into a long, familiar posture. The silence that followed was not expectant, nor watchful. It was complete. Watson noticed it in the simplest way. He woke one morning with the sense that he had slept deeply, uninterrupted by the half-awareness that had lingered for weeks. The flat greeted him with the quiet of an ordinary day, the sort that asked nothing and promised nothing in return. As he dressed, he paused at the staircase, listening out of habit. Nothing answered. Downstairs, Holmes sat near the window, the early light tracing the edges of his profile. He looked up as Watson entered, as though expecting him. "It's gone," Watson said. Holmes nodded. Yes. They did not speak of it further at first. There was no need. The absence itself was explanation enough. The day passed uneventfully. Holmes occupied himself with small matters, correspondence, a few minor observations sent by post, nothing urgent. Watson read and wrote as he pleased. The flat behaved as it always had, the sounds of pipes and boards resuming their familiar, unremarkable dialogue. That evening, as dusk settled and the lamps were lit, Watson became aware of something else. The house no longer seemed to listen. It simply existed. "The difference is subtle," Watson said as they sat together, "but unmistakable." "Yes," Holmes replied. "Attention has relaxed." They spoke then, not of disturbance, but of buildings themselves. Holmes observed that structures, particularly those lived in for long periods, developed rhythms as distinct as any human habit. Floors remembered weight, walls recalled voices, staircases learned the cadence of certain footsteps. Most of the time, Holmes said, these memories fade gradually, but when a life is interrupted rather than concluded, traces remain. Watson considered Edgar Halcombe, a man he would never meet, whose presence had nevertheless shaped their nights. He didn't want to be remembered, Watson said. He wanted continuity. Yes, Holmes agreed, and continuity requires recognition, not exposure. The world, Holmes reflected, had a tendency to believe that revelation was synonymous with justice. Yet there were instances where unveiling did more harm than silence ever could. Some truths served no purpose once their moment had passed. Listening, Holmes believed, was a gentler form of understanding. That night, Baker Street offered nothing unusual. No footsteps, no misdirected echoes. The house breathed quietly around them, its corners softened by lamplight, its shadows resting easily in place. Holmes extinguished the lamp later than usual, lingering for a moment in the darkness. He listened out of habit, then allowed himself to stop. Some mysteries did not end with answers. They ended with peace. Watson slept without interruption. Holmes, too, rested more deeply than he had in some time. The city beyond Baker Street moved through its hours, unaware of the small resolution that had taken place within one of its countless buildings. In the morning, sunlight filled the rooms without resistance. The house received it naturally, without the faint tension that had once accompanied the change of light. Baker Street had returned to being ordinary, yet Holmes knew that ordinary places were never empty. They were composed of layered lives, each leaving behind not ghosts, but impressions, patterns of care, routines repeated until they shaped the very spaces that contained them. As Holmes stepped out into the street later that day, he glanced once more at the familiar doorway. Some stories, he reflected, were not meant to be told loudly. They were meant to be listened to, once, carefully, and then allowed to sleep.